My belief is that difference should be embraced. I think that having different cultures, different sexualities is a very good thing, and that we shouldn't be afraid of it. And ultimately, we should be able to stand up for whoever we are without fear of any violence at all. I think that if we take a simple example of an innocent conversation where one person says to the other, "Oh, there's a couple of queers that have moved in down the road." "Oh, yes, well, what are we going to do about that then? How's that going to play out?" Without somebody saying, "Well, just stop there, why is it so awful? What is so negative about that?" I think that we have to address everybody's negative comments in the most sensitive way that we can to avoid these sorts of situations getting out of control. And I believe that is the way forward, and everybody has a part to play in standing up for people who are different. Being gay has had quite an impact on my life, particularly when I was in my 20s and 30s. I didn't get married, I didn't have children, my mother didn't have grandchildren. I wasn't able to meet my children at the school gate, so I was very different from other young people that I knew, which I found quite difficult. And I felt that I was different from everybody else. Even at work, I didn't disclose my sexuality for a long, long time. And I found that even worse because that was a huge difference. I listened to my peers talking about what they'd been doing the night before, and yet I couldn't really say anything about my life and what I'd done the evening before, because on many occasions I'd been mocked because I had told people that I had been gay, and this was difficult. So I felt very different throughout my life. I had a very different social life to other people, and I didn't feel, as I said before, normal. I didn't come into that sort of normal sphere of life. However, today we've progressed an awful long way, and the LGBTQI community are able to get married, they're able to have children. This is a huge step forward, and I think that progress has made such a difference to the younger generation's life. And I think that's really important to emphasise that. However, for the older LGBTQ person, it still remains a bit of a difficulty. There's a bit of a stigma, not feeling as accepted as one would have wanted to be. And I think that will always remain with older people. One of my main hobbies, pastimes, was dancing. I loved it. I loved the music, I loved everything about it. And I used to go quite regularly to a dance school nearby with friends, and we really enjoyed ourselves every time we went. And because I went so regularly, I got to know the manageress of the dance school quite well, and we'd have lots of conversations about dancing and different steps that she was trying out on the class. And she asked me if I might help out with one of the classes once, and of course I said yes, no trouble at all. And I did that, and again we had a lot in common. We talked about our lives and what was happening to us, where she wanted to go in terms of a career in dancing, and what I wanted to do, which was to be a nurse. And it sort of fell into place quite easily that we became friends. And I recall one day going to her office after the school had finished, and she said, "Oh, let's have a cup of coffee." So I thought, "Oh, this is great, you know." So, and I thought because she was the manageress, she was rather special. And we chatted on and chatted on for an hour, and I loved talking to her. It was something very special that I hadn't had that experience with anyone else. And as the time went on, I thought, gosh, you know, I've got to be getting home. And just as I was about to leave, I said, "Well, I don't want to go, but I've got to." And she put her arm around me and kissed me. And I have to say, it was the most amazing experience that I've ever had, and I will never forget it. For me, it was an awakening. It was something that was so special that I'd never experienced with any of the boys that I've been with before. And I thought, wow, this is so good. I want to know more about this. I want to learn about this. I want to keep seeing you. And that was the start of me realising that I was gay. I hid my sexuality for some time before I was shocked to find that my brother was also gay. And that transpired when friends of mine took me to a party, a gay party, which in those days there weren't many gay parties. Normally people met at gay venues. So this was a first for me, and I was really excited about going. And I remember going to the front door and opening the front door to see the hallway. The rooms were packed with men and women, gay men and women who were together. I'd never experienced anything like this. And so I got myself a drink, and people were very friendly, chatting to me. And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, across the room, I thought, well, that looks like a familiar face. And it was my brother. And it sort of, it rippled through me. No, it can't be. Yes, it can be. And it was. So I went over, not really knowing what I was going to say or how to approach this. But he was with another guy who had his arm round my brother. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And it was from that moment that we realised that we were both gay, and we developed this inseparable bond that we had up until he died. It was very good for me because he supported me throughout all my gay experiences, and for him too. So we had that unique bond, and it was soon after that meeting, when we kept meeting then to discuss how it had all happened for us both, that we decided that it was probably better that we told our parents that we couldn't live a lie anymore. And that we discussed it at length, and he said to me, "Well, look, I think it's better if you tell Mum and Dad first, because if I do it, I'm a man and they won't accept it as much." And slightly naive, I think, I went along with that, and I went to my parents, and I can recall it to this day, sitting in the kitchen, and I didn't quite know how to broach the subject, but I remember saying to both my parents, "I've got something to tell you. I think that I fancy women more than men." I never used the word lesbian, and I thought that was too harsh. So, and that's what I said. Well, my mother was absolutely horrified. You could see it in her face. My father didn't really react at all. And she said, well, you can't be. And, you know, how are we going to deal with this? What are the neighbours going to say? What about the family? And so we had our struggles at that point. And my brother, so I left the house at that point, and I talked to my brother, and he said, look, there's no way that I can now come along and say that I'm gay. And I thought, oh, I was a bit miffed about this, because I thought, gosh, here I am. I'm paving the way for my big brother. Anyway, as it transpired, 6 months later, I sort of spoke to my mum and I said to her, look, this is the way I am. Please, you know, I'm not something out of a horror movie. Why can't you accept the way I am? Because if you can't, then I can't come home. And she did, very grudgingly, I think. My father seemed to take it in his stride. He didn't seem to bother at all. But it was a very traumatic time, and it was probably about a year later that my brother came out to them, and they were shocked again, but less so. So that was my experience of coming out, I guess, to my parents. And that in itself made me very hesitant about coming out to anybody else, because I felt that the shock that it had caused my mother, I really didn't want to put that shock or put myself in a position of feeling upset about somebody else's reaction to my sexuality. I found a different way of thinking and being when I met my last long-term partner, and it was quite a revelation, because she was younger, and it opened me up to different ways of thinking about my sexuality and being more out as she was. And I did learn a lot from that experience, and I was brave enough then to disclose my sexuality to my work colleagues. But my biggest sense of freedom about my sexuality was when we went to Australia. And working in Australia, I worked in the centre of Sydney, which is very gay, so it is understandable. But when I went to work, and it was a new country, new cultural differences, and it was a strange place to be. I was made to feel very welcome as a gay person. I recall working on one of the wards on the first day that I was there doing my induction, and one of the girls, one of the nurses, came up to me and said, oh gosh, you've made a big move coming over to Australia. How fantastic for you. Did you do it on your own, or do you have a partner? And I said, well, I've got a partner. Oh, is that a man or a woman? Well, I completely said, well, it's a woman. And there was just so much acceptance that I felt freer to be who I really was, and to be myself. So it was a great experience, and there was no hesitation about making fun of gay people, which I had experienced even up to probably 10, 11 years ago in the UK, where I think because we are a culture that's sort of stiff upper lip and we don't expose an awful lot about ourselves and things are secret, it seems to stop people from actually talking about who they really are. So this experience was fantastic, and it sort of laid the foundation for my working life in Australia and my social life in Australia. So I actually was awarded a sabbatical for a year from my lovely job that I absolutely adored. And I got a year's maternity leave cover in the UK so that I could be nearer to my mother, spend more time with her. And sadly, my relationship in Australia had ended at that point. So I didn't find it difficult to leave. And I thought, well, it'll be a good experience anyway. So I came back to London and I stayed with my good friend Lucy Ash. And I spent about a month here before I had this tragedy happen on my doorstep. It was 8:30 in the morning on the 25th of September, and I received a phone call from my mother, who sounded very distressed and said to me, "I've just heard from the police that your brother has been assaulted and is in hospital in the Royal London Hospital." Well, I was shocked because I didn't really know what had happened, and knowing that she was an elderly lady on her own, I immediately told her to stay where she was, and I called my brother, who lived close by to her, and told him what she told me, and he went to stay with her. I knew that his friend George was always close to him, so I gave him a ring, and he had told me that he had been assaulted in Trafalgar Square and that his injuries were quite severe. So I immediately ran the Royal London Hospital and tried to find out exactly what his condition was like. And they told me he was in intensive care and that they'd had to remove a clot from the brain. And I said, well, I'll come and see him, which I did. And I went to the Royal London Hospital into intensive care. I was shown where my brother was lying, and I was absolutely shocked to see how he looked. 2 black eyes, shaven head, on a ventilator, assisted breathing. It was something that I really hadn't anticipated ever happening, and I was shocked, and I came away thinking, gosh, I haven't seen many people like this, and having worked in hospitals all my life, I realised that it was probably more severe than they were letting on to me. And they originally had said that once the swelling in his brain had subsided, that he should be able to make a full recovery. However, I really couldn't see that happening, and I was concerned that he probably wouldn't make a full recovery. And I went to visit Ian every day, and George, his close friend, also accompanied me in the intensive care unit, where he never regained consciousness for 18 days. And there was something about the situation that made me feel desperate, really. I couldn't imagine what he would be like if he actually recovered or was able to breathe on his own, whether or not he'd have any residual brain damage. I would have imagined that he would have done. And so I was concerned. And my mother, who had been extremely close to him, was understandably very upset and wanted to come and see him, which she did on one occasion. but really found it so distressing that it didn't happen again. And I think she understood that his life was probably never going to be the same again if he actually survived the assault. And George and I went to see him 18 days after he had sustained the injury. And in fact, they had extubated him, taken the tube out to see if he could actually breathe on his own. And he did for a while. However, it was just as the porters were going to move him to a ward that I saw his breathing was changing. I said to George, you know, I think he's going to go now. And we were both with him, holding his hand, and he did. He took his last breath. It was a very moving moment and very sad on every level about what had happened, how he'd ended up in this situation. But it was probably better for him, and I do think that now. I think that, you know, if he had have survived, he just wouldn't have been the same person. So in some ways, if I'm grateful for anything, I'm grateful that he didn't have to live with brain injuries of any sort. I was finding it difficult to piece together the events that had happened. And George, his close friend, filled me in a little bit on what he knew. And he said that Ian had been walking along the street and some youths had been displaying homophobic taunts towards him, and he said that he was knocked to the ground, and after that some of the perpetrators were kicking and stamping him. Well, I was just shocked. I didn't know anything more at this point, but he said it was a homophobic crime at that point. And the police were also piecing it together, and they didn't know who'd actually done it, and they relied very much on the CCTV footage, which I later was aware of. So soon after my brother had died, I was contacted by Mark Healy, and he asked me if I could support him by putting on a vigil for Ian, which will primarily be about homophobic hate crime, and that as he'd recently died, would I mind that could be the focus of it. And I was really touched by the approach and really had no idea that how that would pan out. But I said, of course, whatever you want to do. And Mark was instrumental in putting on an amazing vigil for Ian in Trafalgar Square, not far from where he last had consciousness. And it was presented by Sandy Toksvig, and there were a number of speakers, all who actually were very involved in promoting anti-homophobic hate crime. And I even got to speak to the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown's wife, who approached me and was so supportive and understanding about how I might be feeling and the actual cause itself. There were thousands of people, 10,000 people there, and they were all there to show their support against homophobic hate crime. It was amazing, and I can only thank Mark for putting this on. I had no idea that it would be as successful as it actually was. And he now holds a yearly event, a hate crime week event, which is supported by many, many different diverse groups. At the vigil, Sandy Toksvig said, "Today we stand up for Ian." For me, it meant that his spirit lives on, which is so important. Also his memories, his friends, how we've all cherished knowing Ian and the memories that he's made with us. He'll never be forgotten because of that. If ever I go to Trafalgar Square now, I always visit the tree outside the South African Embassy where Ian was last conscious. It's important to me to know where that place was, and strangely enough, it's somehow comforting. It gives me some sort of closure to what happened to him. Thinking back over what happened to Ian, at the time I thought, gosh, why on earth did he say that he was gay? He may be gay. I could not understand why he said that. And I felt that he lost his life because of that. And it was pointed out to me some months later that actually Ian was very brave. He was brave because he stood up for who he was. And there is no getting away from that. Everybody should be able to stand up for who they are, and whatever diversity that entails, it's people's right to be themselves. So I have changed my view on that, and I feel now that he was very brave, and I hang on to that. And the fact that even after he was punched to the ground, there was kicking and stamping and shouting, "Faggot, faggot." I cannot believe that anybody could do such awful things to a person who's lying on the ground, who is clearly unconscious and almost dying. And I just found the fact that he was so brave to stand up for who he was such an important thing to hang on to and to promote for the future. Everybody should be able to be themselves, whoever they are. I was living with Lucy when the tragic event happened, and I found that to be a great support. Lucy would talk to me most nights and to discuss what had happened during the day, both with the police and with the media, and tried to help me through what was a very, very difficult time. And one night she said to me, "Well, I really feel that this is something that I want to portray in my artwork. This is something really important that we recognise that this sort of hate crime happens." And she asked me if it would be possible to use Ian as a focus for an exhibition on hate crime. And I agreed to that. I thought that was really a very good thing to do, but I thought no more of it at the time. And as the weeks went by and Lucy started painting, she started doing research on what had actually happened and going into great detail and then translating that into artwork. I watched her, she did it, and I found it really quite supportive in a strange sort of way that I hadn't experienced that before. So this was something quite new for me. And I think that this certainly helped me, and it also gave me a focus for the future because I then became quite interested in art. Not that I know an awful lot about it, but I could see how artists actually developed and created their work. And I loved Lucy's work, so that was really great. And I particularly loved the work that she did for the hate crime exhibition, and the one painting that is in my living room now, which is called Twist of Fate. And this, to me, I love the artwork, and I love the way that it sort of demonstrated what had actually happened that night, and it sort of focused on the actual buzz of an evening in Trafalgar Square, cars going by, different things happening, and then that being turned on its head. And for some reason, it sort of gives me support, and I feel very close to it, and it reminds me of Ian, and that's very important.